Thanks very much, John. It's really great to be part of this conversation. I remember many years ago, maybe even 20, John, when Paul was one of the founders, Paul McColgan of Community Renewal, having conversations with him about what was bubbling up in the Three Towns in Ayrshire and then in Govan Hill. And I remember a conversation about a trolley in a pond in Foxbar and Paisley and things that flowed from that, and how visible signs in communities can either be signs of decay and neglect, or they can be a trigger and a catalyst for something to happen. And Community Renewal has for now all these years and continues to do this fantastic work, and there's so much to learn. So thank you to Community Renewal and all your partners for what you do. I want to say just a few words about our perspective as an independent funder. So the Robertson Trust is, we're more than 60 years old. We are a genuinely independent funder. We do not take government money for onward distribution. That creates huge flexibility in terms of how we go about delivering on our mission, but also a responsibility to do more, I think, about voice and advocacy than we maybe have done in the past, and I'll come on to that shortly. And just to say what our mission is, so we have a commitment to the end of this decade to build solutions to poverty and trauma in Scotland. And that is to not just reduce and mitigate, but also to prevent. And our working model at the moment, and this is not ambitious enough and it will change, but roughly speaking about 3/4 of our grant making is an open, responsive, always-on model of grant making around key primary themes like financial security and education pathways and so on. And so every month we make decisions, and I have a fantastic grant making team who are really, really good at working with especially first time applicants who are just not confident about this kind of world of grant making, where still too much of the power sits with those of us who have the money and we want to shift that. But about a quarter of it we have deliberately ring fenced and said that money over there, that is to try and get back on track with the Christie vision of prevention. It's to try and get back upstream and not just mitigate harm, but try and prevent harm in the first place. And it's hard work. And the more you look at systems change as an idea, the more bewildering it can become. And we've discovered that being really specific about the change proposition is what helps to attract others around those ways of working. Ideally, a proposition, a specific idea, should be a key to unlock the door to do lots of other things, but the more specific you can be about changes, the better. I've got an example to share with you shortly. So that's kind of who we are, what we do. Full disclosure, I should say, our wealth is rooted in Scotland's premium whisky industry. So we are majority shareholders in the Edrington Group, which is a globally successful company headquartered in the middle of Glasgow. People know their brands rather than the company name. If we get this model right, because the products are very expensive, like Macallan, 18-year-old double oak and all the rest of it, which are sold all around the world, if we get this right, this should be a very clear rich to poor redistribution engine. It is of course very small compared to budgets that local authorities have got, let alone government, but if we and other funders like our pals at Cora can be catalysts, then maybe we can disrupt things positively and create some circles that become systems change over time. We'll only do it if we start to shift power in radically different ways. Anyway, I just wanted to say through the lens of our three objectives, our take on this conversation today, and the wrap around this, I should say, first of all, is as a minimum, independent funders, where they can, should try and do what we're trying to do, which is a presumption of unrestricted funding. We're only at about half of our funding unrestricted, and there are barriers in our sector, the third sector, which aren't just about barriers that funders create. So, for example, if we are one of a dozen or many more funders and the bulk of them are project restricted, it's quite hard for charities to sometimes take the risk of unrestricted funding, creating posts that may have to go because other funding runs out and is restricted. So it's not straightforward, but moving in that direction makes a lot of sense. Multi-annual funding, is the obvious thing. We are typically 3 years. We're trying to go up to 4 and 5 where we can, and this is a kind of very short-term measure. But last winter, along with many other funders, we did an inflation-proofed uplift mid-year, no application, before Christmas, to let our grant holders use the money for whatever they thought was right. That might have been paying their bills. It might have been focusing on staff well-being. It might have been a cost of living uplift for their staff, but in the face of the kind of multi-crises, the cost of living crisis coming hard on the heels of the pandemic, this type of flexibility is the minimum to help organisations keep their heads above water. So, 3 objectives really quickly. One is self-evidently we fund. We are here to invest in Scotland's third sector, the length and breadth of the country. What we hear time after time from our partners and grant holders is, for so many of the people and places they serve, who are typically people having the toughest time in our country, what we're living through now with cost of living is worse than COVID. Worse because we're not on it together. We never were with COVID, but there was at least a narrative around that, at least a sense of public health protections, and there were some financial protections across the country which has since been withdrawn. So for many of the frontline charities we fund, they're telling us it is worse. I've got 2 examples to show how grassroots organisations are doing their very best to fight back, and they're different models. And just for balance, one's from this city and one's from Glasgow. Other examples are available, folks. So from Edinburgh, up in the north of the city, lift low-income families together. It embodies so many of the qualities that we were hearing about just before the break from Newcastle, about stopping doing pillar-to-post referrals, working, as they would call it, in a whole family support model kind of way. Crucially, working at the pace of the family's needs, which could be fast or slow depending on what your issues are, and stopping the signposting to individual services for individual needs, working with, getting to know, trusting people, and everything that flows from that. We know this model works. The problem is charities like Lift are not able to keep a foothold get on the front foot around their advocacy and change work, because they keep getting drawn back into the next emergency. It was food, it was digital, it was energy, it's mental health, and so on. And I think that's telling us, as well as other funders, we need to be able to create space in how we support these charities to do the keeping the lights on, the heads above water, and protect space for getting out of the crisis and getting again back upstream and onto the front foot. So twin track funding, we have to do much better in our sector at those kind of ideas. They're also telling us that in the last 2 or 3 years, the demand coming from people who are in work is unprecedented. And thinking through what that means for their response. The other example is from Glasgow. We went to visit them last week, and it's the Courtyard Pantry Enterprise in the north of the city in Maryhill. And this is a pantry when all is said and done. But from it has spun out a very successful catering business and 2 cafes. So it's got some trading income, and it's a really ambitious and very optimistic place to be. Also very clear-sighted about the challenges they're facing, that community. But I also picked these examples because they have spotted the risk in some place-based work, in the past at least, of using tried and tested models which end up inadvertently excluding people. Sometimes our place-based working is quite weak on equalities. Sometimes it's quite weak on disability. Sometimes it's weak on race and diversity and different family types. And these are two brilliant examples of really understanding that and trying to build in from the start a much fuller service offer to the people they serve. So one example from the Courtyard Pantry in Glasgow, they're only open 2 days a week, but they make sure on those 2 days they have got food products that families recently arrived from West Africa need as staples. They can't get them from their corner store, which charges through the nose for the absolute basics. They can get them at that pantry. And they're also finding people who've lived in that community for decades starting to show an interest and start to use some of those products as well. So equalities as a lens for our place-based working, critically important. Anyway, first objective is around doing a better job on funding, protecting space for proactive work. And crucially, I think this does chime with what community renewal does, going beyond meeting needs. If all we're doing is meeting needs, we're always going to be in a spin cycle. We have to move into a space where we are enabling people around goal orientation, around what they want to do with their lives, looking beyond the end of next week, having the headspace to not worry about how they're going to pay bills next week or put food on the table. We have to have a vision of thriving, not just surviving in our work. And it's bloody hard, but it's more important than ever we hold on to that objective of goal orientation and prospect, and not just attend to the here and now needs, and do it in a way that is empowering rather than does unto people. Really briefly, and second objective is around support, and that's on top of grant funding. What can we do to help resilience and capacity in our sector, which is having such a tough time? So sometimes called Funder Plus offers. And in the past, we have made the mistake, along with some other funders too, of offering our grant holders effectively a menu-driven approach. So, which of these 5 things do you want a bit of help with? Is it evaluation support? Is it business planning? Is it governance? And people have told us loud and clear, trust us, just give us the money and we'll procure what's right in our area for the needs that we've got. So we're working towards a much more self-directed model of Funder Plus, starting with some really cool stuff around digital support actually. And you only have to look outside here at Coffee Saints or the trading service that Courtyard in Glasgow are running to see what can come when organisations have got brilliant support on tap, meeting their ambitions. So support on top of funding. And then finally, which is kind of where I came in as well, John, about influencing. And if you are an independent funder, how do you use your voice? But more importantly, how do you create platforms for the people you fund to have their voices heard? I'm really struck that something's changing in our sector, the third sector, which others call the social sector, because why should we be third in the running order and the pecking order? One thing that's changing is, I think we've had a problem of co-option in our sector, and I understand it, is when charities are so reliant upon procured services and contracts and grant income from councils or government. It limits our voice, it limits our ability to speak truth to power, and it was never more important than now that we find those voices again. And what I'm struck by is how this is happening. It's happening in the recovery community. How could it not be when you look at Scotland's drug deaths? It's happening amongst disabled people's organisations and amongst unpaid carers, people who had the toughest time of all during the pandemic. It's happening in a really generative way through the promise, and my goodness, are the stakes high on delivering on the promise. I think what these disparate networks have in common is a desire to not go back into the zone of politeness, to be very, very clear and bold and brave about their challenge, but also come forward with solutions. And the more we can not just critique what's wrong in our country at the moment, but offer solutions that come from people's experiences, which are practical and everyday and necessary, the more likely we are to persuade others, particularly in the statutory sector, that funding should flow over here and not get stuck into complex bureaucratic services that often are not serving the needs they were intended to in the first place. So I'll just finish with one point, John, which is a specific influencing point. We've spotted that the Scottish Child Payment, as an example, money flowing through hard-pressed communities to families with children, almost always to the mothers, is doing a huge amount of good. But at the same time, we are giving with one hand and taking back with the other. The other hand is taking away in the form of council tax debt and other forms of arrear from people who can barely afford to put food on the table. And in some cases, Scotland is behind what's happening in the rest of the UK on how we treat public debt and arrears. Here is a very clear influencing goal for us to ensure that all the good that's being done by the Scottish Child Payment is not being undone by what other bits of local authorities or other public bodies are doing. If we're to understand how to deliver on community renewal's vision, which we absolutely share, we have to understand how money flows through communities. Not just money, power too, but certainly money. And if money in our communities is like water through sand because of ATMs that charge, or the presence of bookies, or other high-cost local shops and services, we have to get into shifting our local economies, and wellbeing economy was mentioned earlier. So it is a massive agenda. I think it's really important that those of us who have a bit of independence and voice and flexibility and resource keep hope alive, and we do that by understanding the people we're funding and serving, hearing their voices and shifting power over time. Thank you very much indeed.